Right now, something is shifting under your feet, and most Americans have no idea it's happening. While the headlines kept you distracted with political theater and partisan noise, Mexico and Canada quietly moved closer together in a way that would have been unthinkable just 5 years ago. And here's what's extraordinary. They didn't do it against America. They did it because of America. Because of the pressure, the tariffs, the uncertainty, the economic brinkmanship that's been redrawing alliances not through diplomacy, but through fear. Trump's leverage was supposed to keep both neighbors in check. Instead, it handed them a reason and a deadline to build something without Washington at the center of it. That is not a small development. That is a tectonic crack in the architecture of North American power that took decades to construct. Because when your closest trading partners stop waiting for your permission and start writing their own terms, that's not a negotiation. That's a signal. And smart people pay attention to signals before they become facts on the ground that can no longer be reversed. What exactly did Mexico and Canada agree to? Why does it represent a genuine blow to American leverage? And what does it tell us about where global power is actually moving right now? Let's get into it. So let's start with what actually happened, because this needs to be understood in its proper context before we can begin to draw the right conclusions. In October 2025, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum signed a bilateral partnership agreement, a direct economic and security accord between their two countries, not a trilateral arrangement brokered through Washington, not a memo of understanding buried in bureaucratic language, a real structured deal between two sovereign nations who share a continent with the United States but are no longer willing to wait around for Washington to define the terms of their future. The deal covers trade integration, supply chain diversification, direct port access, security cooperation around opioid trafficking, and joint production targeting Latin American and Asian markets. And critically, both countries are already members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade bloc that the United States chose to abandon back in 2017. So when you piece all of this together, you realize you're not looking at a side agreement, you're looking at the early architecture of a continental realignment. Now here's what makes this genuinely remarkable. Canada and Mexico are not natural diplomatic allies in the traditional sense. Their bilateral trade in 2024 totaled around $56 billion, which sounds impressive until you compare it to the scale of their individual trade relationships with the United States. Canada was Mexico's fifth largest trade partner, and Mexico was Canada's third largest. These are meaningful numbers, but they were never at the center of either country's economic strategy. That's changing. And the reason it's changing is not because of some new philosophical alignment between Ottawa and Mexico City. It's changing because of Trump's tariffs, his rhetoric, his threats to annex Canada, and his fundamental redefinition of what the United States expects from its neighbors. When a major power behaves unpredictably and aggressively toward its closest allies, those allies don't simply absorb the pressure. They adapt. They find each other. Think about what Trump actually did when he returned to office in January 2025. Within the first 2 weeks, he imposed additional 25% tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, citing an extraordinary threat posed by illegal aliens and drugs. Now, that justification was already politically and empirically questionable. Canada's own Prime Minister pointed out that less than 1% of illegal fentanyl entering the United States crosses the northern border. 1%. And yet Canada was treated as a national security threat on par with drug cartels. That's not a trade negotiation. That's coercion dressed up in legal language. And when countries are subjected to coercion from their most powerful neighbor, history teaches us what they do. They diversify, they look elsewhere, they start building redundancy into their economic systems so that no single relationship, however large, however deep, can be weaponized against them without consequence. And that's precisely what Canada and Mexico are now doing. What makes the bilateral agreement remarkable from a strategic standpoint is the specific ambitions embedded inside it. The Mexican government wants to increase bilateral trade through direct access to Canadian ports, making the country less dependent on existing U.S. maritime channels. Read that sentence carefully. Mexico is actively engineering supply routes that bypass American infrastructure. That's not a hostile act. That's an act of economic self-preservation. But from Washington's point of view, particularly from the perspective of an administration that views trade as a zero-sum battle for dominance, it represents a direct challenge to American centrality in North American commerce. And if you understand power the way serious geopolitical analysts understand it, you recognize that the moment a country starts building alternative routes around your infrastructure, your leverage over that country begins to erode. Not immediately, not dramatically, but consistently and irreversibly over time. Let's talk for a moment about Trump's own relationship with the trade agreement that has governed North American commerce since 2020. The USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, was, in his first term, presented to the American public as his great achievement. He called it the replacement for the terrible NAFTA deal. He boasted about it endlessly. But then something interesting happened when he returned to the White House in 2025. His tone changed completely. He said of the USMCA that there was no real advantage to it and that it was irrelevant to the United States, though Canada wants it and Canada needs it. Think about that for a second. The man who sold this deal to the American people as the greatest trade agreement in history is now calling it irrelevant. That's not strategic repositioning. That's a fundamental contradiction in his own position, and it reveals the deeper incoherence of the economic nationalism he's been practicing. Because if USMCA is irrelevant and tariffs are the answer, then you have to explain why America's trade deficit with Mexico and Canada hasn't narrowed under Trump's aggressive posture. In fact, the U.S. trade deficit with Mexico and Canada widened sharply after the USMCA took effect, reaching a projected $263 billion in 2025, up from $125 billion in 2020. And since Trump returned to power with more tariffs, not fewer, the trajectory has only continued. So the leverage was supposed to fix the imbalance. It hasn't. But the cost of wielding that leverage has been enormous, not just in terms of economic disruption, but in terms of diplomatic trust. Now, let's be honest about something, because I think clarity here is important. The bilateral deal between Canada and Mexico is not going to replace the United States, not in any near-term time frame. The American economy is simply too large, too deeply integrated with both countries, for that kind of replacement to happen quickly. What we're watching is not a divorce. We're watching a strategic hedging operation. Canada and Mexico are not cutting ties with Washington. They're ensuring that Washington can never again hold them over a barrel without consequence. There is a difference, a very important difference, between a relationship of genuine interdependence and a relationship of dependency. What Trump's tariff policies have done, perhaps paradoxically, is accelerate Canada and Mexico's journey from the latter toward the former. They are step by step building the capacity to operate without American permission. And that is a long-term structural shift that will outlast any single presidential administration. Consider what Canada has been doing domestically in parallel with this bilateral push. Under Prime Minister Carney, who came to power with a clear mandate to renegotiate Canada's relationship with the United States, Canada has sought to eliminate internal trade barriers and build new trade relationships abroad to reduce its reliance on the U.S. market. This is a country that trades more with the United States than almost any other nation on earth. Something like 75% of Canadian exports go south of the border. Reducing that dependency is genuinely hard. It takes years. It requires new infrastructure, new diplomatic relationships, new markets. But the political will is now there in a way that it simply wasn't 5 years ago. Trump's aggression has created, almost accidentally, the very conditions he claimed to be fighting against. He wanted American strength reasserted. What he's producing is a slow but visible exodus of trust and alignment away from Washington. And the USMCA review process makes all of this even more consequential. The first joint review is scheduled for July 2026. If the three countries do not agree to extend USMCA during this review, the agreement will terminate in 2036. This is a genuine decision point. And the way things are moving, Canada and Mexico are not entering that review from a position of weakness. They are entering it having already begun to construct a bilateral relationship that doesn't depend on American goodwill to function, that changes the negotiating dynamic fundamentally. Because here's the thing about leverage that Washington keeps missing. Leverage works in both directions. Yes, the United States can threaten to blow up USMCA, but if Canada and Mexico have already started building economic alternatives, the cost of that threat falls disproportionately on American industries that depend on North American supply chains. Think about the automotive sector. Think about Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, companies that have heavily relied on supply chains that include significant parts production in Mexico and Canada, producing hundreds of thousands of vehicles annually in both countries. These are American companies, employing American workers, whose production models were built over decades on the assumption of seamless continental integration. When you threaten that integration with tariffs and uncertainty, you're not just hurting foreign governments. You're hurting American businesses and American workers. And that's not a theoretical concern. That's what's been playing out in factory towns across the Midwest, since the tariffs kicked in. What Canada and Mexico signing their bilateral deal really represents, when you strip away all the diplomatic language, is a fundamental reassessment of risk. Both governments have concluded that the risk of remaining entirely dependent on Washington's goodwill is now greater than the risk of investing in an alternative architecture. That is a momentous conclusion. It means that the Trump administration's behavior has crossed a threshold of reliability and trustworthiness, beyond which rational actors start making structural changes to protect themselves. You don't sign a new bilateral deal covering ports, supply chains, joint production, and security cooperation because you're worried about a temporary diplomatic spat. You sign that deal because you've made a long-term judgment that the relationship with Washington has become structurally uncertain and that uncertainty needs to be managed with new infrastructure. There's also the China dimension that most American commentators prefer not to discuss openly. Both Canada and Mexico are members of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the trade bloc that was specifically designed, at least in part, as a counterweight to Chinese economic influence in the Pacific. When the United States withdrew from the TPP in 2017, it handed China a significant strategic gift. It signaled to the entire Pacific Rim that America's engagement was conditional, that it could be withdrawn at any moment based on domestic political calculations. The remaining TPP members, and including Canada and Mexico, concluded the deal anyway, without the United States. And now, as Canada and Mexico deepen their bilateral relationship and explicitly discuss joint production to target the growing Latin American and Asian markets, taking advantage of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, you're watching the strategic consequences of American disengagement play out in real time. Washington walked away from the architecture of Pacific trade in 2017. The architecture didn't collapse, it adapted, and now it's developing in directions that Washington has no seat at the table to influence. This is what strategic overreach looks like in the real world. It doesn't look like a dramatic defeat, it doesn't look like a moment of obvious failure, it looks like a series of small, quiet decisions made by other countries, decisions to sign bilateral deals, to build alternative ports, to explore new markets, to strengthen relationships that don't pass through Washington. And each of those decisions individually seems like a minor adjustment, but taken together, over years, they represent a rebalancing of the entire global order. We've seen this before. When a dominant power overplays its hand, when it uses its strength in ways that feel punitive rather than constructive, when it treats its closest partners as adversaries, it doesn't lose its position all at once. It loses it slowly through 1,000 quiet decisions made in foreign capitals, decisions that never make the front page, but that collectively shift the gravitational center of the global economy. The blow to Trump is not just political, though it is certainly that. It's structural, because the entire logic of his trade strategy was built on the premise that American market access is so valuable, so irreplaceable, that no country can afford to seriously develop alternatives to it. Mexico and Canada needed the American market more than America needed them, or so the logic went. What the bilateral deal between Ottawa and Mexico City tells you is that premise is being actively challenged. Not disproven yet, not definitively refuted, but challenged structurally by two governments that have decided the asymmetry of dependence has become too dangerous to leave unaddressed. And once that process of diversification begins, once the infrastructure of alternatives starts to be built, it is extraordinarily difficult to reverse. You can renegotiate a trade deal, you can lift tariffs, you can change your rhetoric, but you cannot unbuild a port connection between Mexico and Canada. You cannot undo the supply chains that begin to flow through those new channels. You cannot recover the trust that was spent so carelessly in the first year of the second Trump administration. What we're watching, in other words, is the beginning of something much larger than a bilateral economic agreement. We're watching the early stages of a North American strategic realignment, one that was triggered not by ideology, not by long-term strategic planning on Canada and Mexico's part, but by the sheer weight of pressure coming from south of the border. And the deepest irony, the one that history will remember clearly, is that this realignment is being driven by an administration that believes it's asserting American strength. In reality, it's creating the very conditions that will make American dominance in its own backyard harder and harder to sustain with each passing year. That's not an opinion, that's what the data shows. That's what the diplomatic movements show. That's what the quiet decisions being made in Ottawa and Mexico City, away from the cameras, away from the noise of social media and partisan commentary, are revealing to anyone patient enough to look. The deal between Canada and Mexico is a signal, and the question for America is not whether to dismiss that signal, but whether anyone in Washington is wise enough to read it correctly before it becomes a fact that can no longer be reversed.